Хорошо. Так, ну давайте начинать. Всем привет. Давайте знакомиться. Меня зовут Женя, я занимаюсь тестированием. На данный момент я тимлид команды тестировщиков.
At present, I am team leader of a test team. TDMA is Zaporizhia, Ukraine. I am also, and concurrently we hold informal meetings for testers in our city. If you are interested in the topic, please join us. We share all kind of useful things. You are welcome. The topic of my report is Think Like a Tester, Act Like an Engineer. How this thought was born. At most conferences where I was present, at our informal meetings included, very often question is raised what a good tester should know and be able to do. And very often the talk is on this topic is built on some specific tools and skills a tester should have, but we never speak about how a good tester should think during his work. How he should think in order to be a good tester, my report is focused on. My effort started some 5 years ago when I read for the first time Roman Savin's book, like testing.com. I was very much amazed by it, and I found it extremely useful, and whatever you find wrong, you report a mistake. Quite often you don't have a TOR. At that time, it seemed to me that the main essence behind a tester's work to break a product you have been given to test it. Partially, it is not deprived of common sense, but in order to break something you've given for testing, something must be working initially. It is not always so. The first mental postulate I would like to discuss: make sure the product works. From the onset of my climbing to the tops of testing, I often witnessed interviews, and the triangle problem was very often part of the interview. You must be familiar with it. I have found on the internet this website. It is not our development, somebody else did it. It looks like this. You put in 3 parts, and you get information if it is rectangular. Intentionally, the developers have made 4 mistakes. And in the opinion of the developers, this number is sufficient to test if the product is operational. If you decide to start your checks with negative tests without testing that the product is functional, one of your first attempts might look like this: how the system will work if you introduce a triangle with various lateral sides. You introduce 3 zeros, and the system informs that all the 3 sides are equal. You inform the system that is a bug, that this is one of the 4 intentional bugs. You finalize this error, stating that no zero length is possible, and test how the system will work with negative figures. If you put in 3 minus 3s, again the system will inform you that all the 3 sides are equal. At this time, you start understanding that the system does not work in principle. It could be sent for fine-tuning, but the problem is that to make sure that it doesn't work, we spent a certain amount of time. In our case, it's a couple of minutes, but if it is a complicated system where cases are bulky and not obvious, And in order to produce a bug report, you've got to remove logs. It's lost money for businesses. To avoid this situation, you should initially test if the system does what it's supposed to do, only then switch over to what the system does not, although it has to. Make sure the product works. Keep it at the back of your mind. Only then you can switch over to more sophisticated negative tests. In most cases, it is well to do it while understanding your customer. The second step is understand your customer. Maybe you could face a situation when you are given for testing a typical web store. You prepare the checklist, check registration, authorization, search, payments, and so on. When everything has been verified and money is coming in, you should try to build a portrait, a visual portrait of your user, and try to test the product from the point of view of end user. We know from practice that our Chinese customers could not register because we had Google capture, and Google is blocked in China. We lost customers this. Test these things when the system is fully operational. As far as authorization is concerned, can Arab users use it who write right to left? Search, the same thing. Make sure that the system checks that you can find in your system goods on parts of coincidence or by brand payments. On most websites, the form to put in cards includes 4 symbols by 4 groups, but now there are 15-digit payment cards, 17, 18, and even 19. If you have a strict 16-symbol validation, each client who doesn't have a standard card will not be able to buy, and business will lose money, which is also critical. Delivery. I know that St. Petersburg residents faced it, who in the addresses had building numbers. If your system only has house number and apartment, not building number, it is about lost money. There are many such examples to be quoted. This is what we have encountered personally. In these situations, if we understood our client well, we could avoid such situations. I recently bought a ticket from the Georgian railway website. This is how their registration looked. I tried to register, and the system produced an error information. Username should not have at least 7 symbols and shouldn't start with a figure. Okay, I introduced 18. This tip remained. I went to the competitors, buy the ticket at a higher price from agents. How can this website be so bugged? Localized, the errors are clearly visible. I went back to the website, trying hard to register, and was interested why I couldn't do it. After 15 minutes, I understood that this information refers to the password, not to the userman. A real client will not do what I have gone through. He will right away go to a competitor. If user waits more than 4 seconds and repeats an attempt twice, no more. If a user cannot register, he will leave, the business will lose money, and this is critical for the people who are your direct customers. Marketing has a customer doesn't buy a punch, customer buys a hole in the wall. Your website, your application is no more than a tool. If it doesn't serve the purpose, expected intended purpose, the user will leave. There is a good phrase that quality is when the customer comes back, not the products. Customer must be able to find you, to get you. The second postulate, understand your customer and test your product proceeding from this understanding. The third postulate, apart from the customer, try to understand your product. Now I would like to get acquainted with the audience. Are there people among you who can write or at least understand the program code? Most of you. I'll try all the same to comment what is written on the screen. There will be many codes, but hopefully it will be understandable to all. When I started my work with testing, I began it like most with manual testing. In my work, I used checklists I found in the internet, did testing. They found some errors, bugs, but the problem was I didn't understand why I was going through checking those data. I used the checklist and found the tool Selenium IDE. It's a recorder with which you can write your actions in a browser. It was my first step towards automation. A certain period of time, its possibilities became short. I switched over to Selenium WebDriver. And during the work with it, I understood that it is cool, but in order to use it, I must know a programming language. I chose Java. And apart from writing tests, I tried to develop myself and solve problems. One of the problems like this. I had to create a problem which would put on the screen the closest to 10 out of 2 digits, like 7 and 8. The decision is 8. Then I wrote this code from top to the bottom. A, 8, D, 6, 10, diff 1, diff 2, the difference, and if the first difference is smaller than the other one, then the closer is the first one. In the second case, the closer to 10 is the second digit. The program showed me that everything is successful. I did it in such a nice way from the first attempt, and then I understood that I would break it as a tester. The problem is that I extract the figures, and then they only work when they're between 0 and 10. In one case, the difference is 2, in the other case, it's 4. But if the figures are higher than 10, like 11 and 29, the first difference will be -1 and -11. -11 is smaller, and I will get an answer that the closest is 29. Thus, I found my first logical bug. Then I started thinking how I would correct it using module library and functions. Physically, its distance, it cannot be smaller than 0. If it is, then I multiplied by -1. The difference was 1 and 19, so now it's built successful, but it only starts the bug series. This functionality will only work when I have different figures. If these are similar figures, I have corrected a little bit. The difference will be the same, but the system has to put out something. But the system has to come out with an answer. It showed to me that the answer is B, but it's not correct because both are close. If the figures are equal, then they're equally close to 10. Everything is okay, everything is corrected, but no. If the figures are equidistant to 10, but on different sides, then it indicated a mistake. The difference between 8 and 12 is 2, but the answer would be B. I corrected it. The problem was that I compared figures but didn't compare the difference. I corrected it. The system came out with an answer, and all this process is a very cyclical one, and the most primitive problem was written with this horrendous number of corrections, and there are zillions of bugs. The system will fall if the ABR equals these figures, because these are limits which I use in the case. If I suddenly wanted to correct billion differences, I'll have to rewrite my program with the big integer tool for working with big figures. I'll have to rewrite everything. Even if I wanted to correct decimals, it is not just changing it to double. The system will be different depending on the variable you use. There is a popular example. We have two variables. Double A means one decimal, double B two decimals. Sum is 1 plus B. What the answer would equal? I would like to add. It won't be 0.3. Yes, that was a correct answer quoted. The answer will be like this. There is a whole website dedicated to the event. It looks like this. If someone is interested mathematically, it explains why it happens, especially the floating comma mathematics. JavaScript knows it like this. It is not sufficient to change the value. It is important to know peculiarities of the language, comparing 0.1, 0.2, and if I decided to put exponential figures, lines, or figures like in America, commas separating thousands from hundreds, null, infinity, true, false. In each situation, the system would have fallen, and I would be forced to add an extra code. There is such a thing when people gets into learning new things. He passes through 4 stages. First thing, unrealized incompetence, as though you are trying to explain to your granny who you work as. Usually I explain to my granny that I'm a programmer. My granny is not competent enough to understand why I'm paid money for working with the computer. Then it is realized incompetence. When you start...
So, and then you understand that, but you are still incompetent. And then it's recognized incompetence. It's when you know all the tools, you know when to use this or that technologies, you have some experience, you've got some understanding of that. So most of us are in this square. And there is the stage of unconscious incompetence. It's when a tester has some experience. It's like a driver with the experience of 30 years. So he just works unconsciously. He can operate the car, all the levers, the buttons unconsciously. In order to reach this unconscious competence, we have to have great experience. And to reach this stage, it's not enough just to be a tester. You have to be an engineer as well. You have to combine 2 components from the both squares, to think as a tester, to act as an engineer, being unconscious but still competent. That's it. Thank you. You're welcome to ask any questions. Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I have several questions. The first one, is it the task of an analytic, like Google in China or length of the map name. Yes, but tester can sometimes combine several roles. He can be an analytic, and PM, and developer, a good guy, right? Yes. The second question, when you understood that you are unconsciously competent and you start to develop and edit Java driver, so can you tell us your call story? How did it happen? Was it because of your company, or did you dedicate it to your personal time? Because some developer testers say that they want to know Java and just wait until it develops by itself in them. No, it was half a year, but during half a year I couldn't write even one outer test. I asked my boss, can we change something? He said, okay, we'll have a little less load, project load, then you will have 1 month, you can dedicate some work time to learning Java, but also you will have to work at home. And well, after that I had quite good effect, and I could really identify the bugs in the sports where earlier I couldn't even think of them. So you say that a tester has to check the code in order to understand what kind of cases they have to implement. In the perfect situation, yes. In some cases, we can even see that the situation won't be processed at the level of the code, which you otherwise would check on the product. From the point of view of prod, it will be just very quickly, high quality, and less painful, as if we identify the problems at the stage of production. It's probably more like incompetence of the developer, right? Well, in a perfect company, unit test is when developers write the code. There are no critical bugs, but not all of them can make really good code. Sometimes we have to adjust ourselves to different types of developers, different levels of developers, right? Thank you.
So?
Is that it?
Добрый день, спасибо за заклад.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. Could you please tell us, so you already told us about the second point, that we have to listen to the needs of the customers, to some peculiar features of the users, but how do you share inside the team with this information? You can't be expert in all fields, you can't be a master of all trades. So there are some peculiar features of Chinese internet shops, for example, and nobody but the expert in this area knows that, or similar things. There is no straightforward answer, because in my team, every person has his own task, his own project, and he is responsible for that. And he is master of all trades within his project. So he has to know all the peculiar features of this project. But in the perfect world, I would allocate experts in design, UX, responsible for logic, functionality, separate people, but in business we don't need it, because we have to pay only one person to be efficient. But how do you train people? For example, one person was working with Chinese internet shop, and you want his competence and the knowledge he got while he was working to share with others. Well, in our case, it's implemented through the mechanisms of the information interchange. So we make conference calls for the testers, and if there is some untypical bug that they want to share with each other, so they can use these meetings and conference calls. And that's quite good, because people are always updated on all the projects, and they can know about some specific problems and bugs. In the last section, you also said that unconscious competence is the highest level, after even higher than the aware competence. Why this recognized or aware competence is lower than unconscious competence? Well, from the point of view of psychology, it's when you do everything correctly, but you don't even have to think about how to do it all. Because at the level of recognized or aware conscious, so you have to check against some sources, some references, but here you just act and that's it. But in this case, probably you can estimate incorrectly the task for a colleague because you are not aware of the complexity of the task. You think that it's very simple and you think that everybody knows that, but you forget about some special things, special features. But estimate, yes, it has to be done by a person who will be directly involved in this task. Because if I delegate it to a newcomer and tell him that it will take 40 minutes, but there's a lot of functionality, logic, etc., and newcomer, layman just can't do that, and then of course it's a problem. My question is that when you think starting as a tester, seeing bugs in all cases, and when you identify something, you call it a bug and try to fix it. Then you get more and more seniority, you start understanding programming, you start understanding databases, and then you understand the implementation, and sometimes you come to understand that a small bug. So if you think as a tester, you would say that this is a bug, but you start acting as an engineer and you understand what are the consequences and how much effort you need to fix it. And then you start to be more like tough, rough, and skipping the bugs. And when you discuss with your dev and you say, oh, this is a very complex case, it's not possible to fix, let's leave it like that. But at this point, the conflict starts, like even inside the person, like internal conflict. No, we didn't come to that yet. My task as a tester is just to report. Of course, the ideal perfect is to fix, but if they say we have to change half of the project, let's leave it like that. Okay, that's up to PM. I have found it, I have reported it, I know that this is very complex, it was implemented in some very crooked way, but well, this is up to PM to decide whether to fix it. But the backlog grows, right? It's normal, because if you don't document all that, the backlog is not growing, then every new tester finds it, discusses it, but something happens, right? There is a format which is called zero policy when you estimate the criticality or influence. So, and if it's lower than some point, then you just skip it. I mean, if it does not allow some of the users, and if it is related to some very insignificant part, and you just find error, yeah, then that's a problem. But everything that is higher the scale, then you have to do something. So this is like an instrument of working with the backlog. So you can skip half of that. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Elena. So the guys have already asked you. So have you developed the task, or at some stage you just decided to leave it? Well, yeah, it was not possible to rewrite it. It was implemented at this stage, and if we try to correct it and to bring it to a perfect condition, to bring it to the life, I mean, then I would still be finding the bugs, correcting, and there will be a separate project to fix all these bugs. But it was all coming with the years, right? Years of the development. So, and you are looking at this task and you understand that it's not possible to finish it. Yeah, during the first year I completed several tests and thought it's great, but then I understood that nothing great in it, it's too complex. Maybe we have to delegate this task to juniors, outer testers, to write it. Well, at this point I was a junior. Senior wouldn't even try to deal with that. They are not interested. But you get used to checking very unusual situations, and For a junior, it's quite normal task, especially when at every stage you make a review and you understand that if I do this and that, it will collapse, so then it will fail. But for a junior, it's okay. Good afternoon, thank you for your presentation. My question is, when you start checking the code, what is the probability, according to you, to look at the product from the point of view of the developer, not the tester? When you're not looking at the code, but actually you're acting as a customer and thinking more about the logic, about this stuff. But because when you start looking only at the code and thinking about the code, so then maybe you become less involved in, you are less on the side of the customer. Well, you're professionally degrading in this case, right? But it's not degradation in some common sense. Yeah, you develop in some area, but you lose something in another area. Yes, I try to look at the code. I forget about the influence of the business. I don't think about the code. I know that it was written in some way. I try to abstract away from that. So I know that there is a black box and the white box. And that's it. Yeah, my personal experience shows that when you look at the code, this is one way of perception, but when you look at the product, this is another way. So where is this boundary between these two types of perception? Yeah, it's very vague. I abstract away. When I'm testing, I try to look at from the point of view of the customer, but when I look at the code, I'm thinking as a developer. I'm trying to imagine that this is my task to write this code. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, at which stage is it necessary to check the code? From point of view, I mean, that the tester needs to check at the very beginning that the product is working, and only after that to look for some negative scenarios. For me, when a tester looks at the code, he tries to think of the logic, tries to find some problems. It's like negative analysis. But in many presentations, they say that first you have to make review of the code and then pass it to the testers for testing, basically. Well, in our case, it's not even sent to the test server until the review of at least 2 team members was received. So we need both. But it much depends on your team. So it means that before the tester, the developer has to take a look at it. Developer is higher levels expert. But why tester should deal with that if all the logic has been checked by more efficient, more professional people? Yeah, but still some bugs can be found. Because in some cases they try to find some special situations and they look at the so-called frequency of the code, on the purity of the code. But still there are some bugs. So the tester and developer have different view on that. But this is secondary check, right? Only if you have time you do that. Well, normally we have time, but sometimes it's difficult to refuse to do that because the business demands that. Normally it's developer's problem. Normally it's like you take some test, you take fragment of the code, you find several bugs, quite logical, but if you don't identify them, that's a problem. Is there some sense for a tester to make this review if no developers do this review? Any review is better than the absence of the review.
Снова возник вопрос. На вашем опыте, что проще, быстрее, дешевле?
So what is easier for tester to get engineer skills or for the developer to learn how to test and to test his code himself? So the developer is aimed at creation, but tester is aimed at destruction. So to change destruction for creation is easier. For the developer, it's more difficult. He cannot test his own child because he assumes that it should be working, but when he starts testing it, getting negative results, for him it's difficult to recognize it. I very often encountered the cases when people had the task to cover 100% and they were not checking anything. They were making tests, 100% coverage, but they were not actually checking whether there are some bugs or not because they just didn't want to. The best question was asked by this lady. One or two? One. There is one more. Thank you. If you like my presentation, please put the corresponding sticker